Okay, so further challenges. There's no right click. So how do you get around the fact that on a mouse in a desktop interaction, you have the option of clicking and right clicking? So previously, one version was that you would press and hold with one finger and click with another finger, tap with another finger. Now the convention is that you tap and hold. But of course, there's a learning issue here in that if you don't know what that kind of gesture or type of movement is, then you can't right click. So there's a convention which is unspoken but not standardized. And then how we hold the phone is important. So we've kind of expressed this idea of a thumb zone. So thumb zone is if you hold your phone with one hand and you scan your thumb around, where can your thumb reach? So how do you access things above that, which are typically difficult to access? To access things that are closer to your hand, you end up making quite an unnatural kind of movement to clench your hand together to reach it. And so manufacturers have put some effort into figuring out how, now that we know where people use them, now that we know what that human factor is, how can we manipulate that? So Apple, for example, you can double tap the home button. I think it's a double tap anyway. But you can do something and it will pull down the screen so that you can click things on the top. So if you go to Twitter and you just type in Luke W, Luke's got a whole range of these kind of studies where he's looked at the human factors of how people use phones and devices. He's looked at how people hold them. He's got a whole bunch of data on how often people use landscape versus portrait, all that sort of stuff. So if the human factors of how people use these physical devices is interesting to you, that's where I suggest you go and have a look for some more background data. And if we look at network speed, so lots of studies by lots of large companies, because this is about revenue. And revenue decreases the longer it takes your screen to load. So we know that if the internet doesn't load, or an internet page, a web page doesn't load within a few seconds, people get irate and they'll go someplace else. And that's probably most important in terms of Google. So you're trying to access sites. If that doesn't load quick enough, you're not going to see sponsored sites, so Google's going to miss out. So Google manipulated the load time of different pages and found that if you delay by just half a second, it drops search traffic by 20%. So 20% in terms of probably 20% of revenue for Google just for half a second. So that's compared to Amazon. They delayed by only 100 milliseconds and found that 1% loss in sales. Now in 2008, that was $191 million in lost revenue. That has to be billions of dollars now, if you look at how Amazon's exploded in terms of the size of the company that you are. So all of these big companies, their main driver is to make sure that things load fast. They don't want to lose you to another search provider. They don't want to lose you to another shop, another online store where you're going to want to spend money on something that's faster. So what they do is they start to design custom applications for mobile devices. They will load things in a certain order so that you get the most important information first, so that images can take that fraction of a second longer because you're focused on reading something. So it's quite smart in the way that they prioritize the provision of that information and how they might remove certain parts of information in order to adjust to your network speed. What you really want to do, of course, is mobile first design. So a lot of people will have heard of responsive web design. Responsive web design was an approach that was developed in response to the increasing number of mobile devices that people were using. So what responsive web design does is it takes a desktop and degrades it gracefully, ideally, into a mobile screen. So what you end up with is all that content that was on the desktop now rearranged so that you can scroll down it in a logical order. Mobile design is the complete opposite. So what mobile first web design does is you start with a content focus. You start with a phone and you're looking at what content do I actually need to display. So by only having that mobile screen, you do really focus on the content. You're using the smallest space that you have to work with. So if you can get all of the content in that smallest space, the theory is that by increasing that space, you can do more things. So when you increase the space, you would typically change the layout, you would add more decoration. So you might have lots of decorative images, you might have adverts displayed differently, so you might have adverts in sidebars rather than as a tile interrupting your content or appearing and disappearing in front of the user. So all of these things need to change, and that's where user experience as the design focus to this will really play a part. So it's looking at how people perceive those changes, and are you aware that actually what you see on a phone is the same content as you see on a desktop? And from a brand point of view, you have to be able to see that that's one cohesive display of information. But the other reason that using mobile devices is really, really important is if we start to look at, particularly in different continents and different countries, in a lot of continents, people just don't use a PC. So in the United States, greater than 50% of people use more mobile than PC. If you look at Africa and Asia, 50% of people do not use the internet on a PC. So if you have a mobile first design, the argument is that that is better than a responsive web design because it's designed specifically for that device. So it's designed for how you operate a phone. It's designed for the fact that you need larger icons. It's designed for the fact that you have that fat finger problem. And so how someone interacts with that will be very different because the human factors of interacting with a mobile device are so different to the human factors of interacting with a desktop. So if we have mobiles, we have tablets, we have an assortment of additional things, smartwatches, smart bands, all of these things. All of these things connect to the internet or via each other connect to the internet. And so what's developed is this idea of the Internet of Things. It's very close to ubiquitous computing, the idea that computing is everywhere and computing is every part of everything that we do. But how we use data and how we use the internet, given this abundance of devices, has led to this specific branch of the technology industry that's looking at networking, it's looking at the human factors and the human interaction with these devices or sensors, and it's looking at how all of that data is presented, processed through machine learning or AI in order to have a consequence. So some of the examples of things that people are doing with the Internet of Things, if we take the home at a very simple level, you can engage commercially with the Internet of Things by buying Philips Hue light bulbs. You can connect them up. I can use my phone to make that happen. My phone is a sensor in itself, so when I come home, when I hit the GPS area that my house is, the lights will come on. So now I don't need to turn the lights on when I come home after dark. They pretty much just turn on when I'm walking up my driveway. I can do things like start to monitor safety systems, so things like smoke alarms, carbon monoxide sensors, heat sensors. I can monitor battery power online. I can start to say, okay, I can see that this battery's getting low, I need to go and replace it. I can see when things get knocked off the system. So safety within the home is improving. If you think of clocks within university buildings, clocks are an object on the Internet of Things. They're all Wi-Fi controlled. So if you look at a clock in a Dalhousie building, it'll have a small Wi-Fi symbol somewhere on the clock face. And when the clocks go back or forward, just some guy in a room changes the time and all the clocks will click back. I don't think they can quite program them because it always takes till the end of the first day when they should be changed for it to change. But that's mass control over multiple displays within a building that I can change. I can start, again, safety within a building. So I can start to look at the position of people and occupancy and whether or not that's safe. I can deploy employees to different parts of a building in order to keep it secure. And in terms of personally, kind of health and body stuff, so I can monitor things like my heart rate, but I can also monitor lots of people's heart rate. So I can monitor patients, and I can see when patients need intervention. And within cities and transport, I can have sensors on buses that will tell me how far away they are from the nearest bus stop, and I can display that information. I can detect how many people are on my bus, and if one particular bus route gets busy, I can divert buses from other areas to cover that problem. So all of this plays into the idea that the internet is gathering, or data is being gathered via the internet, and then changes and consequences occur because of that data. So of course there's big privacy concerns, and there's concerns over how my data is stored, where it's stored, so GDPR has played a big part in that. It's concerned with who has access. Did I allow you access for that purpose? Are people repurposing my data for something else? All of these things are concerns that consumers have around the use of the Internet of Things. If my data is anonymised, GDPR says I can gather anonymised data with no problem as long as I can identify a person. So often I can't, but if I'm working with a very small population, if I'm working with AAC users, for example, that they may be identified solely by anonymous data because I know where they are. I know, where they are, what device they use, when they went shopping, here, there. And so someone who accesses that data erroneously or criminally will be able to access individuals, even though I have not gathered the data. So all of these concerns and worries make a very big picture about the Internet of Things, but the benefits that it brings to us are huge, and a lot of people are very, very invested in the benefits that the Internet of Things can bring. So take health monitoring. Health monitoring has been a big thing for a long time. We can track distance, we can track speed that we've been running, we can track heart rate, we can track our tennis swing, we can put sensors into balls, sensors into rackets. And how we use that data for consumers, it's often an interest. For a casual athlete, it's maybe making some difference on a small scale. But if you look at, for instance, a British cycling team, the British cycling team had this mantra for many years about marginal gains, and all of that was data-driven. They were tracking everything. They were tracking what kind of mattresses their athletes were sleeping on, how many hours sleep they had, what type of sleep they had, how fast they cycled, what the average incline was, what their energy output was. Everything about these athletes is monitored. And all of that together gives them that fraction of a second edge over someone else. For an average person, that data probably looks like this. This is probably all the information that an average person wants. If someone's really into running or cycling or whatever, then they'll have something like Strava that they can gather information from. But generally, this is what people are using it for. They're looking to see, how active have I been? Combine that with my Fitness Pal an app like that, so I can start to track calorie intake, I can track my weight, and all of those things. They're very marketable. If you look on Instagram, it's everywhere. Health and fitness in terms of tracking data is big business. So how we interact with those apps and those technologies, we have to know. So if you take a scale, for example, there's clearly an area where you could put your feet. So the affordance is like where the physical properties of an object give you a clue as to how you can interact with it. So on a Microsoft Word ribbon banner, that might be that something looks like it's slightly higher than the rest, so it's clearly styled as a button that I can press. For scales, the affordance is 2 foot shapes on it, and so that's clear that I can step on it. So understanding affordance and the psychology of how we interpret objects means that I don't need any explanation for my scales. I can just use them. If you look at my fitness pal, it's a very simplistic interface, and so many people can use it. And I only know how to make that simplistic interface because I know about human factors, I know about how people click, I know about how people scan, and I can measure all that. I mean, my fitness pal are gathering data on how people use their system, and then they're using that to improve their system. Within health and fitness, we can look at mental health and well-being, so you can monitor symptoms, you can start to understand conditions or disorders. So, I mean, apps like Headspace are guided meditation apps, but they'll let you track how often. They'll also let you track moods, so you can start to see, are there patterns in having a high mood or a low mood? Is there certain situations that are causing that? And I can perhaps share that information with people that you would want to share it with, or you can keep it personal, it's just on your device, but you can still gather data and information about mood and stress and that sort of thing. I can track conditions that are requiring medication, so I can check whether someone complied with medication if they record when they did it. But things like asthma and diabetes that require some level of monitoring, then that's important, and I can use technology to do that. So I can use the Internet of Things to do that, for example. So let's take asthma. Asthma, you might measure peak flow, particularly when you're ill, when you know you're around something that might trigger an attack. So if it's cold weather outside, for example, you might measure your peak flow. And all peak flow does is measure how capable you are of getting air out of your lungs, which is clearly important for breathing. So peak flow, you typically have a very crude device which you then need to record, but you get new peak flow monitors now that are they're internet enabled, so they can, all you do is blow your peak flow, and that saves that to an online source, and I can look at it in an app, and my doctor can look at it, and so this is the benefit of having all of that data, that actually people are going to become potentially healthier because they have access to all of these additional assistance with monitoring. Some people are just interested in mobile data tracking. So if you take Chris Dancy, you can go and Google Chris Dancy. But Chris Dancy basically is a bit of an activist for data privacy, and he highlights that by basically gathering as much data as he can on himself, and he appears to just gather the data because he can. So he gathers data on, where he's been, who he's interacted with. He gathers data in terms of how much he's walked, what apps he uses. He will use data to control his environment. He will have little cameras that are attached to him that take photographs so we can look back at his day. But if you can gather the data, Chris Dancy has gathered it. So up until now, sensor really just means something that gathers data. And typically that is mostly what we do is on a smartphone. If you look at kind of usage across devices, smartphones, because they're the thing people have in their pocket, they've got lots of sensors on them, so some of them will detect temperature, speed, change in direction. I've got a compass, I've got GPS, I can track my location, I can do all sorts of things. But the mobile space is changing to be more than just phones, and more than just phones and tablets. So phones have gotten bigger, tablets have kind of gotten bigger as well, in terms of screen size, but then in came the smartwatch. So the smartwatch has got a very small screen when you compare it to the other screens that you have. The sales of smartwatches are increasing, the variety of smartwatches that are available to people is increasing. So you can see how by introducing this, basically new device, it's been around for a few years, it's been kind of commercially popular for quite a few years. The Apple Watch is probably the most common, but you get lots of different ones. Samsung do one that's very popular, for example. But these all run into different problems, right? So what's the division of labour with these things? Are they just an extension of a mobile phone? So the very first ones, yes, definitely, they were an extension of a mobile phone. Now it's changing. So I can get a watch that has its own 4G data access now. So I can use my phone as a standalone device. I can use my watch as a standalone device. Now I don't need a phone to use my watch, whereas previously it was reliant on the fact that I had a smartphone of the particular type with a particular OS so that it could transfer information back and forward. The context in which I use one or the other is very different. So I'm not going to try and book a train ticket on my smartwatch, most likely, but I may well do that on a phone. If all I want to do is quickly check a notification, that's quite easy on a smartwatch. It's attached to me, I don't need to pick anything up, get anything out of my pocket. And so watches tend to be very much glance-based interactions. They tend to be very much quick, snappy interactions, often with the human receiving the information rather than inputting information. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but generally I'm seeing that something has changed. And so from one step down the line, how do you design interactions that use both of these parts, right? How do you allow people to seamlessly switch between using a smartwatch and using a smartphone when very clearly they've got different purposes? One has got a much more lengthier interaction than the other. One is much easier to interact with. So although we still have challenges interacting with mobile phones, it's not as bad as interacting with a smartwatch. The challenges aren't the same. So if we view it as an extension of a mobile phone, then that's fine. I personally think it's going to remain as an extension as a mobile phone for most people for quite some time, until we solve a lot of the input issues that we have with smartwatches. So you get a whole selection of these things. Some of them look very clearly that they're a smartwatch. Some of them look more like traditional timepieces that you wouldn't. So, this looks very much like a traditional watch. You would never know. There's a lot of customization. So the screens are all very different. One got a notification for an email. One's got a calendar on it. One's got the sunset on it. And so you can very much have something that's unique to you on your wrist that you can do things with. So typical use cases so far tend to be things like notifications, that's the primary one, using a timer. So if I'm cooking or whatever, you can set a timer. For sports, you can set a timer. I can pay with my watch, that's become much more socially acceptable. It's a fashion accessory. Timekeeping, can't overlook that. I had a smartwatch for about 18 months, and in the end, all I ever used it for was timekeeping. I turned off all of the notifications because my phone, beeps constantly. It rings all day. So if I don't turn them off, then I just feel very under pressure by my watch telling me, buzzing all the time or beeping all the time. Even on my phone, notifications are all silent. They don't vibrate, anything at all. But that's a personal thing to me. I can quickly reply to a text message. So if I get a notification that there's a message, I might have some preset text that I could reply. I can take a phone call on my watch. So this is as an extension to a phone idea. My phone rings, but I'm cooking. I've got bread mix all over my hand. What am I going to do? Well, I can press my phone again. I can press my smartwatch against my nose. I can use my nose to activate it. And so all of these kind of workarounds are things that are enabled because of the fact that we have a smartwatch with us. So these challenges that we see in designing for smartwatches are basically the same challenge largely that we see for mobile devices. So there's a limited screen real estate. You've got the fat finger problem. How do I know if I'm clicking on the right thing? The screen is much, much smaller than a mobile device, so a lot of the icons are now shrunk. So how do I deal with that? Actually, I deal with it by I can zoom in and out. So that I can have bigger icons or smaller icons, perhaps. Battery life is often poor on these things, so you might get, if I was really solidly using that as an input device, it's not going to last the whole day. But the additional thing is that it is solely a one-handed interaction. I'm wearing my watch on one wrist, and so I only have the other hand with which to interact. And so that has an implication in that it reduces the complexity, because naturally, the size of the watch, I maybe only need 2 touch points. Naturally, because of the position of your wrist, and you can try it, right? Try and touch a watch, or if you're not wearing a watch, where you would. It's very difficult, actually, to use fingers other than your thumb and index finger. Because once you do that, you start having to really move your elbow. And that's not a natural position. So if I can do things just using these 2 fingers, I get a better interaction. So up until now, most research effort has really been on text entry. That really hits those issues of screen real estate, size of my keyboard. If you thought the keyboard was small on a phone, it's now much smaller. But it also gives you that challenge of how do you zoom in and out. And so these YouTube links are just links to different systems that have been created just to let you see some of the different approaches that people take. So one approach might be the zoom board. There's one called zoom board, and that is that if I click or tap, then it zooms into that area of the keyboard, and then I can tap again, and it zooms in further, and then I can select a letter. So my error rate should be smaller because I'm progressively getting closer to the thing I want to click. However, that's now 3 taps for every 1 letter that I want to enter, so my speed is going to decrease. So this whole thing is a balance between speed and accuracy, with a kind of side consideration of learning effect. So how long does it take for me to learn that thing in order that I can be fast and accurate? So all of this gives us an opportunity. So in terms of human interaction and how we interact with technology, that's changed massively, in my lifetime, and it will change more in the future. How I use technology, by the time I've lived a whole life, is going to be very different to looking back that very first phone that I had that made phone calls and could send a text message. The amount of rich data, the amount of rich interactions that are available is terrifying in terms of the change over that period of time. So we know that we're going to sell more smartwatches. In terms of wearable devices, fitness bands have gradually increased over time, but smartwatch had this big boom around the release of the Apple Watch. Lots of people have smartwatches of some sort, and we know that we're using more and more data. So we know that the data that we are sending globally via mobile devices is huge. So in 2010, we used almost 22 exabytes, and an exabyte is 1 billion gigabytes. And that is increasing and increasing and increasing. So what does that mean that's next for smartwatches? So the way that we interact with them, the way that we design interfaces is going to change. We've gone from, in terms of devices, we've gone from desktop PCs to phones. So you've got that degradation in screen size. You've got the challenge of batteries, battery power, connectivity, all of these things. And so if we go from desktop to mobile, the way that we interact has changed. We're doing short interactions. If you want to do something that's very task and performance based, you tend to go to a larger screen to do so. And so smartwatches will then be the opposite end of that. They'll be very much glance micro interactions and used for very small amounts of things. They'll be used hugely for data gathering, feeding into that Internet of Things that we have. Because a smartwatch is a more reliable measure of me than my phone is. I can sit my phone down. Someone else can use my phone. Someone else can go to an application or a website, and my phone will add it to that picture of what it understands about me. But how many times is someone else going to use your smartwatch? So when I start to look at the data representation of me, things that come from wearable technology is going to have priority over other things, because that's what's going to make a clearer picture. So what are these new interactions going to be? So people are going to be wearing these things for convenience. It's going to free up my hands so that I can be doing things with my hands while using these devices, using a smartwatch. So it could give me information, it can relay pictures and so on, but a smartwatch isn't the only wearable thing that I can have. Already we can see that on mobile phones we can use BRAILLE and we can reappropriate screens. People who may not be able to see but they can still use a screen with some tactile feedback, we could start to use that on a smartwatch. We can use payments, so payments is very much a micro interaction, it's very quick. I'm not even using the screen, I'm just using the sensor that's contained in my phone. The socially accepted part still has a question mark, depending on where you go and what sort of establishment you're in. Sometimes you get a bit of a strange look if you try and pay with a wristwatch rather than using a phone. The elderly generation as a whole have great security concerns about it because, and this is a sweeping statement, but if you don't understand the security that is behind banking applications, you don't trust them. Because you don't realise that the data that you see and the data that the bank sees is not what is transferred between the phones. So that data is encrypted. And if you don't understand how encryption works, then you are going to be suspicious of these things, and you can understand why. Because it seems like your information is available all over the internet. And of course there's an issue about physical abilities in terms of the kind of twist that's required and whether or not mobile payment screens are set up for wristwatch payments. So if I take that picture as an example of a typical payment device, it's probably might be on the desk. It may also be kind of slightly elevated off the desk, but that's not the most ergonomically pleasing position for me to have my watch. If I am standing at a payment kiosk and the sensor for me to make a payment is towards my right hand side, but I wear my watch on my left hand side, again, there's a physical change there. So a lot of things, while we can do stuff with your phone, doesn't necessarily mean that it's physically the best way or the most comfortable way for us to do things. So the most obvious problem here is something like the London Underground. So in order for me to use my phone or some kind of non-contact thing contactless thing in order for me to go through the barrier, that's on my right-hand side. That's on my right-hand side because most people are right-handed, but most people who are right-handed wear a watch on the left hand. And so if you've ever gone through somewhere like Oxford Circus, it's a crazy amount of people, all trying to get through these little gates to get to where they want to go. And so if I start using my watch on my left hand, I'm slowing up that queue. It just looks odd. So the social acceptability of using that is perhaps less. I mean, if you look at using a mobile phone, yes, it's great for tourists. I don't need an additional card. The amount of people who still want to buy an Oyster card just because Oyster card is a thing that's existed for years is incredible. Maybe they don't trust their mobile phone's going to have battery, right? So if I don't have battery, I end up paying the maximum fare. Older passengers, if they don't trust their phone, are they alienated from that option? You might have multiple cards. That's just a physical challenge of which card did I use and which card do I need to activate so that I do get that max fare cap and I'm not paying more than everybody else. And the final thing that has really changed how we interact with phones, that I think is probably going to be a big change in the future, and in mobile technology certainly, not just in mobile phones, is going to be augmented reality. So if you want to augment something, you need to add some perceptual information, something that I can sense. So that might be visual, auditory, olfactory eventually, something that adds to my sense of reality. So it might be that I can superimpose things on top of stuff, it might be that I can see additional information, whatever. But the very first mention of AR, the very first idea is this picture here. So it was a big contraption that hung from the ceiling. It was not portable whatsoever, certainly not mobile, but it allowed you to add things to your environment. Nowadays, this is what augmented reality looks like. So on the left, you've got, so this is a flight. This is additional information that's being presented to the pilot. Fighter pilots have them on their goggles, so they can see things on their goggles that will provide additional information in terms of that particular flight and what's around them. It reduces the gaze shift. So some newer cars now have them on the dashboard. So the sat-nav will be projected onto the window, and that reduces the cognitive load and gauge shift of looking at the road, looking at my sat-nav, and back at the road, because it's superimposed onto the road. So when I look at the road, I see exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and I can process both the road and the instruction simultaneously. The HoloLens is being used in healthcare. So it's being used to demonstrate that we can map additional information onto the human body, that we can model the human body accurately enough that we can actually prepare for operations and things like that using something like the HoloLens. And I think really the first commercially popular use of AR was Pokemon Go. So ironically, that picture does not use AR, but if you were using AR, the background would be exactly what I see, and so I can have Pikachu, sitting on my desk. So all of these things with augmented reality, they're not always on phones, but they're on mobile tech. So mobile tech now is becoming more than just even the phone and the smartwatch, but it's starting to include glasses. So Google Glass was the first real kind of idea that this could happen. It wasn't hugely commercially successful. There was a lot of eye strain wearing the glasses over a period of time. And so that's kind of gone back into Google X to be redeveloped, which it is being, but in the meantime, things like the HoloLens have come out. Obviously, you're not walking around the street wearing a HoloLens just yet, but over time that will become smaller. So that concludes the mobile HCI slides.